Hi, everybody. I'm Eric Johnson. I work for the state of Alaska, the Department of Natural Resources and the Division of Agriculture. And today we're going to be talking about farming on permafrost soils or specifically Alaska exempt wetlands. And today I have Dennis Mulligan from the Wasilla Field Office with the USDA NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Dennis, I believe you've worked in Alaska quite a while. Do you want to tell our audience a little bit about your background in Alaskan soils?
I've been a soil scientist in Alaska for 27 years now. I've been with the agency for 33 years, so I've got quite a bit of soils experience, and a great deal of that actually was in the interior. So I have a lot of experience with permafrost soils as well.
When do people generally become a concern about permafrost soils, or specifically the Alaska exempt wetlands? And
so for any Alaska exempt wetlands and for any wetlands at all, it becomes a concern for with the Food Security Act when you make production of a crop possible. So if you're planning on farming and planning on potentially using USDA benefits, which could include anything from farm loans to crop insurance to just technical assistance from your local field office, you really want to go and go through all the steps, go to FSA, fill out the 1026, get your farm and tract numbers, get your fields established with them, so that they can request that wetland determination and highly erodible land determination from me.
excellent. So the areas that are generally could be classified under the Alaska exempt wetlands, that's interior Alaska, that's not Point McKenzie or the Kenai Peninsula so much?
Correct. So the definition of Alaska exempt wetlands are wetlands that have a preponderance of permafrost, and when that permafrost thaws, the soil will drain internally. That doesn't mean you clear the thing off and then dig a big ditch around it. But it's land that will be cleared, permafrost goes out, and then the land will be drier because of the loss of the permafrost.
Before we get further into this very interesting conversation, I want to remind our viewing audience, if you have specific questions about Alaska exempt wetlands or permafrost, we've got John reviewing the chat. Please bring those questions in. We'd love to answer them live. And I just thought of one myself. So 2 years ago, Dennis and I, we were out in Trapper Creek, and we saw some soils that was a couple 100 yards from a water body. And when we dug down, there was that seasonal frost that created a leaching layer, and it was really kind of whitish soil. Is that something that would be covered, or is seasonal frost part of the picture?
So permafrost by definition is soil that's been frozen for at least 2 years. So the stuff that's going out annually, in and out, does not qualify. So if you've just got a spot that thaws late, but then once it does thaw, it dries out, that doesn't count as Alaska exempt. It has to be permafrost. And then the other part of that definition is that it has to have an ability to have high production agriculture. So when we get a little later on into the presentation, we'll cover some of those, the characteristics of the soils that we'll be looking for those.
Excellent. And is pasture considered a high production?
So typically, as we get into this, we'll be talking a lot about compliance with the Food Security Act. And so when we're talking about highly erodible lands or wetland compliance, we're talking about soils that are being annually cropped. So if you've got something that's in hay or some kind of a forage, or even peonies, very popular in the state, those are under perennial cover. they're not annually tilled. So we're really only talking about annually tilled.
That is an
Crop
excellent
lands.
key difference. Thank you for, I'm glad I asked the question. We clarified that.
right.
What legislation covers, or do you want to go into your?
We can just
presentation?
jump into that since
Yeah.
that's actually the first slide. So one of the reasons that wetlands, and particularly Alaska exempt wetlands, becomes confusing is because there's two specific pieces of legislate. But let's go ahead and bring up the slide if we can. Okay, so there's two specific pieces of legislation. One of them is the Clean Water Act of 1972. One of them is the Food Security Act of 1985 as amended. And they both mention wetlands, and at the very surface, they're both defined as wetlands as being places that have hydric soils, hydrophytic vegetation, and wetland hydrology. However, just because of there was time in between these two pieces of legislation, different legislators over the, these have both been around for a long time. There's been amendments to both of them. So the definitions of these three parameters have deviated somewhat. So when you talk about a wetland determination for the Food Security Act, it is not exactly the same thing as a Army Corps of Engineers Clean Water Act determination. They're not interchangeable. And one of the things is that the Clean Water Act, if you're going to drain a wetland or alter it in any way, remove woody vegetation, et cetera, you're going to need a 404 permit, and that carries some legal responsibility with it. It also has an expiration date, and I can't remember exactly how long they last. When you get a determination from USDA, the one thing you have to consider is that all of our programs are completely voluntary. You do not have to participate. You can go out and farm, you can grow potatoes, you can grow carrots, whatever, and not participate in any USDA programs. We think our programs are great. We don't know why you wouldn't want to, but they are completely voluntary. So okay, so what does it mean to be in compliance? So with the wetlands conservation's provisions. So because the law itself was brought into existence in 1985, any wetlands that were converted before 85 are sort of grandfathered through. Those would get a prior converted wetland, so if you can show proof that farm has been in existence, that field has been in production since before 1985, there's a pretty good chance that it's going to be qualified as prior converted.
So any land cleared at Point McKenzie, Point McKenzie was not likely to have permafrost, but if they had cleared a regular wetland, would that pre-85 clearing of a wetland also grandfather them in? Sorry to
Right.
throw a whole different subject in, but
So
that's
they
a
wouldn't
good question.
qualify as Alaska exempt because they didn't have permafrost. However, if they had gone in when I don't even know when
82, let's say.
Okay, let's just say in 1980, if Farmer John went in and cleared his stuff and he realized, oh, this corner of my field is a little bit goopy, and he dug a ditch and it drains off. Yes, that would very likely be either a prior converted, or frankly, if his ditch didn't work, but he's still farming it, it would be considered like a farmed wetland or something similar to that. But yes, so if that activity was done before the law was enacted, then they're going to get.
Excellent.
Now we're going, okay. So again, we covered those when we looked at the two laws. So we've got a preponderance of hydric soils. In other words, these are soils that are going to have some kind of genetic observable criteria that you're going to be able to say, like either there's you dig a hole and there's water in the hole, or you dig a hole and you've got very, very thick, very dark, organic material. Or you have, what were called models. You'll have a bunch of splotchiness in the soil that's actually caused by, the wetness. So the soil scientist will be looking for that, possibly me. The wetland hydrology, again, is just saying that the water is there for long enough during the year to have it go into anaerobic conditions. In other words, the soil microbes have used up all of the free oxygen there, and they're stripping it off of other places in the soil. And the hydrophytic vegetation, again, for the Food Security Act actually defines it as literally plants growing in water. That's the definition in the Food Security Act. With the Army Corps of Engineers, there's some other things where most of the plants in Alaska have been given some kind of a ranking on a scale of how wet they are, whether they're obligate to live in a wetland, or whether they're facultative, can kind of go both ways, or whether they're an upland plant. And so they would get, every plant found in that field would get a ranking, and then you would do a bunch of math calculations to find out whether you had hydrophytic vegetation based on that.
That's a lot of information. How much do you charge for such an inspection? That seems like would take a full day or 2 days at least.
It does, and if you're planning on participating and you fill out that 1026 form with Farm Services Agency, it is absolutely free. It's on your taxpayer dime. You've already paid for it.
I know a lot of farmers are definitely cost conscious, and that's a great service that you guys provide.
All right, let's see. So again, this is going back to, we kind of already mentioned this, that the eligibility, you would go in and talk to the Farm Service Agency, maybe talk to the NRCS field office. They can help you fill out the 1026 as well. And so because the act has been amended a number of times, so from 1985 to 1990, you had to actually be planting a crop in order, so you could find yourself in a violation if you went out and planted a crop on a wetland that had not converted when you cleared. From 1990 on, the definition actually says to make production possible. So basically just removing large woody vegetation to the point where you could drive a farm tractor across it makes it meet this definition. So it's definitely, if you're going to do land clearing and there's a potential for agriculture there, definitely come have the USDA make that characterization before you start doing that. Just because you don't want to find yourself crossways with the act before you even start.
What if you're super lucky and a forest fire came through, burned up all the standing spruce, and left a perfectly flat, mostly vegetation-free field that was then dry for a year or two?
Yes, so like in the interior, for example, we know that happens. I mean, it happens some in the Tochaket, Nenana area. It's happened throughout Fairbanks, and probably even some in Delta. So that definitely does happen. Like I say, here in the valley, if you had a big forest fire that went through and like a Trapper Creek or whatever, chances are those wetlands, they were big peat bogs, and when they burned, guess what? They're still peat bogs. So there wasn't any permafrost there to go away. So they were being, that hydrology, that wetland hydrology, was being driven by something that was fully regional.
Gotcha. So in the case of Fairbanks, it wouldn't apply because
may
if the
apply.
fire caused the permafrost to drop out, then you're there's no permafrost.
There's no permafrost. If I go out there and do an observation today, it's not there. There's not an agricultural field there yet, right? It's
Correct.
there. So it's not like somebody was out there trying to manage that land. They didn't do the clearing. They haven't done any plowing. It's just a permafrost-free site that doesn't appear to have any water in it. I'm good. I gotta pay attention to my buttons. Okay, so we've covered kind of a lot of this. So if I was to go out there and I dug a hole, I found permafrost. And we're gonna look at, we've got a couple of pictures of this towards the end of the thing too. So, I find permafrost, but the soil's nice and silty, or, it's got a nice loamy texture. There's every reason to think that there might be gravel or some sort of, internal drainage at depth. Maybe it's got just enough slope that it would, not too much slope, because you don't want to get highly erodible, but that 0 to 12% slope, I think, is the cutoff. So that 3 to 12% slope is going to be considered that you're going to have enough surface drainage to have that water flow off. So, so then at that point, I may actually make the call of Alaska exempt wetlands, right? Or I would look at adjacent fields that are on the same landscape, on the same soil type, things like that, and try to see how they're reacting to management. There's a lot of tools to use here. So we use this, Alaska exempt wetlands actually occurs in the law because of Ted Stevens. Ted Stevens, when the state started doing when the Food Security Act came out, and we started doing a lot of these agricultural projects in the Barley Project in Delta 1 and 2, Kobe and Browns Court, and any number of them. Ted Stevens said, hey, a lot of our land is going to be wetland and will not be able to be productive. So he basically came up with this law. So it doesn't occur anywhere else in the law. So actually, when I make the AEW call on those, it actually doesn't get recorded anywhere. It just gets recorded as a non-wetland. So that's kind of interesting. And again, these AEWs are not recognized by the EPA or the Army Corps of Engineers. So this does not fall into their definition for how they're going to do their 404 permit. This is only in Food Security Act. So this is just a little blurb. This is going way back. You can see that it's dated in 1989. So I mean, very, very early on so that the definition of this is a wetland because it's got permafrost, and if it thaws out, it'll drain and become productive is literally the only thing in the law. So it kind of fell to the soil scientists and agronomists within USDA to come up with a definition of, well, what does become a productive piece of agricultural property actually mean? And so here's sort of the little list of the criteria that would get a soil into these class, capability class 2, 3, or 4. And in this case, I think that's 4C. And those are, I should have worn my glasses. Those are just far enough away that I can't quite make out, but I don't want to read. So basically what we're going to be looking for is something that's not shallow to bedrock or some other root limiting layer, right? You want to have at least 20 inches of soil. It's going to have a good quality texture, right? So something that's in those loamy, a nice loamy texture. If you notice all those textures that are listed there, it's like loamy fine sand, loamy, very fine. very fine sandy loam. Almost everything's got an L in it. That means loamy. Typically, you don't want something that's too clayey. So this is something where like in the Copper River Valley, where it can get kind of iffy because that was a big lake bed and there's a lot of clay there and not very much slope. So a lot of those areas, the permafrost might go out, but there's enough clay to hold the water so that it's not going to drain. And, we see that as well. Again, but you do want it to hold enough water for the plant. So just a gravelly sand is not a desirable texture. Usually wouldn't be for very much agriculture anyway, unless you're growing watermelon or something. As you go farther and farther down the list, things get pretty sciencey and pretty technical. But you can see there was a great deal of thought went into what sort of soil would make a good agricultural land.
Before you move on, where can folks find this definition of this list online?
So
that listed later.
Probably the best place right now, and we can do another one of these someday, on how to use web soil survey. So we actually have a report built directly into web soil survey that is going to tell you whether you have a high likelihood for having an AEW soil. Now, that being said, also looking at the caveat down at the bottom, actually having a professional soil scientist who is familiar with what the criteria for Alaska exempt wetlands are is the person that's going to have to make the call. Just because you generate the little report and your map is either red or it's whatever, that's going to give you an indication of what your probability is, but have somebody come out and look, go to FSA, fill out your 1026 and have them request for me to come out and do the determination. So carrying on from here, so this is basically what we'd love to see, right? This is very typical for a interior Alaska black spruce forest. Almost everything in Fairbanks and Delta looked like that at one time, right? And that's what you want to have happen is, you clear it off, the permafrost goes out, it drains beautifully, your barley grows, you can drive your tractor across it and not get stuck. This is the ideal situation. This is a little example from near Fairbanks. This is actually a golf course, but I selected this series of pictures just because I knew when this area got cleared, so I knew that I would be able to find pictures that show the progression, right? So this farthest one off to the left is the black and white from 1996. You can see in the lower portion, everything's very bumpy. That's from when the ice wedge polygons, the wedge ice went out and it left all these bumps. And you can look kind of out across the field there, and there's not a lot of lakes and ponds and wet spots. But then you move to later on into the 2000s, early 2000s, suddenly there's a bunch of lakes and ponds. The bumpy stuff is still there. You move a little bit farther down the timeline, they've completely abandoned the bumpy stuff, right? I mean, it's turned into such a roller coaster that they cannot manage it. And the wet spots are not getting any better. And then you move on to, I think the last picture is in 2017. And so this is sort of the worst case scenario. This is an area that probably would not qualify as the Alaska exempt wetland, right? Because it's just going to turn into something that can't support agriculture. At some point, you would not be able to drive your tractor across. In fact, it would be dangerous to drive your tractor across it because you might fall into a hole.
And I think I know where this golf course is. There is a bit of a watershed feeding into it, so it's definitely at a lower spot.
Right. And that's, well, that's typically
That's
where
why
you're
it's
gonna
still
find
a
it.
wetland. I mean,
Right.
I mean, permafrost is gone, but drainage of water into collecting into an area is always going to be a wetland, so.
Yep.
Just because permafrost leaves, like he's been saying, if it's a wetland, you're not gonna get any assistance. You cannot, you should not.
Well,
Clear that stuff.
Yeah, don't clear it. Yeah, just. So that's kind of the end of this little presentation. If Mo has any other questions.
Well, I have a quick question, hoar frost, where it's like granular versus lens frost, which I think is indicative of these pictures. Can you talk a little bit about the difference of kinds of permafrost our farmers might encounter? Is one quote unquote more suitable to be converted to agriculture? I assume the poor frost would be, whereas the len frost, after it's gone, it's just gonna create such undulating areas that it still probably wouldn't be really suitable for agriculture.
Right,
What are your,
so the pores, of course, the pores in soil are relatively small. And so it's where the ice just sort of fills in kind of the entire matrix of the soil. So all of that pore space is actually filled with frozen water per se. So when you start running into problems, i.e. with lenses or with wedges, lenses being horizontal, wedges being sort of these big vertical V-shaped ice segregations. That's what we call them, so it's actually segregated ice. It's actually pure ice. And we also know that ice expands like what, 30 some odd percent when it freezes, right? So water's only this big, the ice is going to be this big. So when it thaws back out again, you lose a lot of volume. And then the water itself is eventually probably going to go away too. So you're just losing a great deal of volume, and that's when you end up with all the crazy roller coastery
things you don't want in a field?
Exactly. And two, so I think Mo had mentioned earlier too, so it's like, so your permafrost goes, maybe you had ice wedges, your permafrost goes away, it's very bumpy. Can you just take a blade and go out and like smooth all this over? The answer to that would be, have somebody come and look, because those, the odds are that the very convex bumpy parts will be dry, but those concave areas that are in between could still be wet. And if you go and fill those up, that's going to put you in violation of both the Clean Water Act and the Food Security Act.
As an have we had any questions from our viewing audience? We have not. Well, I think that is pretty much the end of today's presentation. I want to thank Dennis for coming in. Please, if people have additional follow-up questions, we'll probably can put, can you just spell out your email address, or how do they find you?
Pretty easy. My personal or my work email address is Dennis, DENNIS .Mulligan, MULLIGAN @USDA.gov.
Excellent.
So pretty easy.
Well, again, I thank everybody for listening in today. This has been great information. We've had several requests for it, and I think we're going to have more requests in the future of this information. So thank you, and everybody have a good day.